Well, this fall on our farm, we had some of the best soybean yields we've ever had. In fact, we had 2 full fields, big fields too, that went over 70 bushels per acre. It was just tremendous, and it reminds me of when that Philadelphia Phillies pitcher, Roy Halladay, threw the no-hitter, and right afterwards they asked the manager to comment on it, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Well, that was good managing right there." and so we could say, well, that was good farming right there when we got over 70 bushel beans. And, you know, we made a few right decisions this year and everything, but we were also very blessed having good weather this year for the most part. But you've got to be able to take advantage of that good weather, and we wanted to talk today about some of the things we learned with soybean yields in both the good conditions and some of the bad conditions we also had on our farm.
Okay, so you say we had this great weather year. Well, I'm kind of wondering what year you're talking about here, because we started off this year, we had all kinds of rain. It kept on all through the summer.
It was dry early. We planted early.
Well, we planted corn early.
Then it started
Then
raining.
we had a nice little break in the middle of bean planting because we're getting all this rain, and we kept getting rain all through the summer, which, you know, hey, we need rain. Don't get me wrong there. But when you get lots of rain, you end up with some disease pressure, especially early in the year. This was a huge Phytophthora year early. There was some more Phytophthora in some areas later on in the season, just the way the weather played out. And seed treatments made such a big difference, specifically fungicide seed treatments.
Yep, that was huge. So we had a lot of farmers that were treating their beans for the first time this year with either the fungicide. Some people also did insecticide, and it turned out to be just the year to do it because almost everywhere in the country it was too wet, and when it's too wet, you're usually dealing with an overabundance of diseases. Talking about being too wet, we also had a very interesting thing happen this fall where the river came out of its banks by us in the fall. It's happened before many times in the spring, but never in the fall. So we had running water going across some of our beans that were fully mature. So I don't know how those are going to turn out. We'll harvest them in a couple weeks when it's finally dry enough to get out there. But surprisingly, when the water went down, the beans still looked pretty good.
You know, we'll see. And that is kind of a strange thing. But one thing that wasn't so strange for me is shooting for high yields. And when you look at what the USDA says that a soybean crop needs for nutrients, a 60 bushel crop needs 228 pounds of nitrogen. 228, that's a lot. Well, how about a 70 bushel crop? It needs even more. And when a plant needs lots of nitrogen like that, and especially a legume plant, you say, wait a minute, I didn't put any nitrogen fertilizer on my beans, maybe just a little bit with some MAP or DAP or something like that. How do they get that much nitrogen? Inoculant this year played a big role in many of these high yields because we need a lot of nutrients.
Well, yeah, but I mean, inoculant for $1 or $2 an acre isn't going to give you 50 pounds of
No, it's
nitrogen.
not going to do all this for you necessarily,
help.
But it certainly can, because legume plants like soybeans can produce up to 70, maybe even a little more percentage of their nitrogen needs.
Yeah, the plant can do a lot, but just to put some inoculant out there and expect that that's going to give you 20 or 30
I don't
bushels,
think it's going to give you this
usually
huge
it doesn't.
deal.
Typically, you're only talking, 1 to 3 bushels. This year, in some cases, I'm sure it was 5. So inoculant definitely was something that was
for
important.
$1 or $2 investment, that's a pretty smart move. And year in and year out, that's paying very well.
Yeah, but you talk about the nitrogen. I like to look at the phosphorus and the potassium side because we have to fertilize our beans for that. And if you look across the country, very few farmers are fertilizing with much phosphorus and potassium. Well, like the 70 bushel beans that we had on our farm, and our whole farm average probably be 60, that's pulling out a tremendous amount of P and K, especially the potassium. A 60 bushel soybean crop is going to pull out about 84 pounds of actual potassium, actual K2O potassium. It's going to take us 150 pounds of potash if we want to just replace what we removed with the grain only. It's a lot of fertility. So we just want to make sure that if you're pulling off big soybean crops too, or big corn crops, that you're at least replenishing the nutrients that you removed.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting this year too. Some of the guys that had great big soybean yields said, wow, where did this come from? Well, they had some carryover fertilizer from their corn last year. The corn yield was disappointing, or they had some kind of issue out there where they didn't get a great crop. In those fields, their bean yields are way above everything else. And it comes down to fertilizer in many cases. The guys are still using 2-year programs. Maybe you're one of them. You need to consider that, because a 2-year program that you were using just a few years ago, now with the higher yields that we're getting in corn and soybeans, is just not cutting it.
And the other thing is, because of the warm weather that we had some more mineralization out of the soil. Basically, the organic matter broke down, released some more nutrients. But, you know, we didn't have great soybean yields everywhere. A lot of the country is suffering from poor soybean soybean yields because it was too wet, or in some cases it was too dry. Some people are saying it was too hot or too cold. It's all across the board. Overall, soybean yields actually weren't that great this year for a lot of people.
Okay, hold on. You're using all these weather excuses, and we are guilty of the same thing on our farm. Oh, if we would have just had one more rain,
but
it
if
would have
it's
made a
flooded
difference.
out, like in South Dakota, at least 20% of the acres were flooded out either before or after planting.
That's fine. I'm not talking about where the crop's flooded out or hailed out. Absolutely, the weather is the only factor that's important there. But let's talk about that crop that we had some soybeans in the 50s. We had some soybeans in the 70s. And you think about that and you can say, oh, well, maybe that field didn't get as much rain or something like that. No, it's management decisions from one field to the next that very often play a big role. Because sure, maybe you got a 1/4 inch rain instead of a 1/2 inch rain when you really needed it. But if you have the right management decisions, it's not going to come down to just 1/4 inch of rain that's going to make all that difference. It's how you set that plant up the whole year through.
And the other important thing here is when you talk to some of the top soybean or corn or wheat farmers all across the country, and you say, well, what's your secret? What are you doing to get such great yields? And you go through their whole program and you say, well, I'm doing that. I'm kind of doing that. Well, that's not too tough. No big deal, no big deal. You go through all these things, you say, okay, well, where's the secret? They say, well, I showed you everything, that's it. Now, you're like, well, it can't be. But what it comes down to when you talk to all these great producers that we have in the country, you'll find out that it's just attention to the little details, because you can pick up a bushel or two here or there. You start doing this step and the next step and the next and the next and the next, and pretty soon you've got 60 or 70 bushel beans instead of 40 or 50. It just takes some extra management, and you've got to spend some time at it if you're going to make that happen.
So this fall, don't just look at soybean yield plots and say, wow, well, that one variety must be that silver bullet I'm looking for. Most of the time, it is not. I mean, there are some differences between varieties, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot of little management decisions that you make throughout the year, starting with how you're doing your tillage this fall or putting on your fertilizer this fall to planting that seed in the spring. It's very important.
Well, another management decision you've got to make on your farm, if you've got our Weed of the Week, is how are you going to control it? We'll tell you later in the show.